a specific topic. We are going to talk about blockchain and technology. So welcome all of you that in the transmission on Facebook. And this event is organized by Startup Society Foundation in collaboration with the Institute of Competitive Governance and the Policy Laboratory for Security and Development. This is a think tank that we are going to focus on this government information and economic development in the special economic zone. So my name is Montserrat. I am VP for Global Affairs, and I'm going to be your host today. So now our great speaker is Darcy Allen, who is an academic economist and writer. He is currently working on the economic and political economy of blockchain as a research fellow in the Innovation Hub in Australia. So he studies blockchain as a new type of economic infrastructure and the implication for this global economy. Our speaker has been published across economic law, public policy, and in different journals. And also he's publisher for books, including the terms of new technologies, of freedom, cryptodemocracy. It's about how blockchain can radically explain democratic choice. So this is going to be our specific discussion today. So I remember to you, we have a space for Q&A by the end of this event. So para toda la audiencia que nos está escuchando en español, puede escribir sus preguntas en español y nosotros las traduciremos para nuestro ponente. So if any has any question, we are going to start now with this incredible event. So Darcy, if you are ready, the microphone is yours. Thank you so much for being here today. We hope you like this event, and please follow us in our social media and enjoy it. So Darcy, the microphone is yours if you want to start right now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I hope that everyone can see my screen at the moment. I'm just going to assume that you can. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Darcy Allen, so I'm an economist, I'm an academic, and I've been asked to come and talk to you today about blockchain technology and special jurisdictions. I'm going to spend a bit of time on the initial technology itself, blockchain, and help to understand how do we understand this technology? Why is it different to other technologies? Why are people so excited about this technology? And then I want to talk a little bit about special jurisdictions. The main takeaway that I want you to have is blockchain is a new type of institutional technology. And what I mean by that is blockchain is a technology of governance. It creates new rule systems. So whenever I say institutions, I want you to think about rules. Rules that protect property rights, that enforce contracts, all the rules that we have in an economy. Now that's what blockchain is innovating on. And this has a lot of potential to act as the infrastructure for special jurisdictions. But in many ways, we can also think of blockchain technology as a special jurisdiction. So I know a lot of you at the moment are in Mexico. It is truly amazing that you can be in Mexico, but you can be writing smart contracts or transacting using blockchain technology. You can essentially exit to a different jurisdiction without even leaving your own home. And I want to go through some of these exciting developments. So who am I? Well, I'm a member of the Blockchain Innovation Hub. We set up this team back in 2017. We're a social science research center into blockchain technology. And what that means is we're not going to bore you with the gory technical details. We're not engineers. We're not computer scientists. I'm an economist. We have lawyers, political economists, ethnographers. And what we're interested in is what does this technology mean for an economy? What does it mean? How does it change what an economy looks like? Does globalization shift in a different way? What jobs does this affect or create? So that's the perspective I'm taking here, the perspective of an economist. So what I'm going to talk about today, I guess we can say there's three main things. The first one is I want to briefly introduce blockchain technology to you in a non-technical way. So I'm assuming some background here. I'll leave you to go down the rabbit hole of cryptocurrency and blockchain on your own about how it works. I want to talk about why this technology is different. Then I want to talk about what does that mean for how we understand the blockchain economy. How should we think about this technology? Where might it be applied? Where does it make sense? And then finally, I want to talk about blockchains as a type of special jurisdiction, and then the potential for blockchains for use in special jurisdictions across a few applications. And today, elections are very topical at the moment, so I thought I'd talk about the application in voting, so we can have a little discussion about that. So let's begin. Blockchain technology, what is it? Well, first you need to understand the problem. The internet is a truly remarkable innovation, and one of the main features that it has is that we can copy data again and again and again at very low cost. You can take a picture, you can take a file, you can take whatever you like and endlessly copy it. This is an amazing feature, and it's brought us the communication and digital age that we live in. But that is a terrible characteristic if you want to try and transfer value over the internet. So if you wanted to create a digital cash for the internet. And the reason is obvious. If you're trying to transfer value, as with money, how do you know that someone hasn't copied that money and spent it multiple times? This is known as the double spend or double spending problem. And this is a really hard problem to solve. And in the 90s, people trying to create digital cash really struggled with this problem. Because the problem is essentially, how can we transfer value, whether that is money, whether it is property rights, whether it is any other kind of registry, over the internet digitally without using a third party in the middle? But the question is, how do we maintain trusted ledgers of information? Now, we normally solve this problem on the internet with centralized third parties. If we wanted to transact value with each other right now on the internet, we would go through a bank. If we wanted to undertake some kind of trade, we might use an intermediary like Amazon in the middle. The point is, the way that we solve this problem of trust on the internet at the moment tends to be with third parties in the middle of us when we're transacting. Well, people are very excited about blockchain technology because it potentially solves that double spend problem, that problem of how to create decentralized ledgers and registries on the internet without using a third party. So in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto, we don't know who they are, proposed a solution to the double spend problem using creating a cryptocurrency called Bitcoin that I'm sure almost all of you know now, using a technology called blockchain. So what is a blockchain? Without too much detail, a blockchain is a ledger, it is a distributed ledger, but we should think of it as a blockchain is consensus, so it's group agreement over the contents of a shared programmable ledger using economic incentives. So what a blockchain is it is a ledger held by potentially thousands of computers across the world, and we use economic incentives to get that network to update the information of the ledger. Whether that is a ledger of money, whether it is a ledger of votes or healthcare data or identity or whatever it is, we use economic incentives to get the network to update the ledger, right? There are now thousands of different types of blockchain technology and applications across the world, and they all do it in different ways, right? So I'm not going to go into precisely how that consensus process happens. All you need to know is that little diagram on the bottom right-hand side there. We worked out how to create a decentralized ledger of information on the internet. So that's what blockchain is. But let's give a little bit of step away from that hype for a second. There are a lot of problems with this technology, right? It is very new. It's only around 12 years old now. And you will hear these criticisms all the time, that it's slow. Right? Where the word blockchain came from is generally a blockchain is, all it is a series of transactions. So if you took the Bitcoin blockchain, all you're going to find is a transaction after transaction after transaction, which have been time-stamped. So we know when they happened, and they've been signed using cryptographic signatures. We take all those transactions, we put them into blocks, and the network comes to agreement about that block. They come to consensus that we agree what is in this block is legitimate. Then they start a new block of transactions, transaction. Once that block gets full of transactions, the network comes to agreement again. Do we agree with all the transactions in this block? So all a blockchain is a list of transactions that a network has come to agreement to over time. But this means it can be slow to come to agreement. It can be expensive. It can be hard to scale if there's lots of transactions coming in. Those blocks fill up really quickly. I don't know if any of you have tried to buy cryptocurrency. It's gotten much better in the last 6 months, but it is an absolutely horrible consumer experience if you've tried to do this even a few years ago. There's an argument this is just another database. And there's of course the argument that this may destroy the planet. So the Bitcoin blockchain is based on a consensus mechanism, an algorithm essentially, that uses lots of electricity to come to consensus over the Bitcoin blockchain. Well, these are all problems here, but they're all being solved at a remarkable pace. The pace of innovation in this technology is almost like no other technology we have ever seen. And these are the problems that entrepreneurs are focusing on right now. And that's why you see hundreds, thousands of different blockchains with different consensus mechanisms. Some are faster, some scale more effectively, some don't use that electricity as a way to come to consensus. These problems are being solved. And so let's put aside all of the technical problems with blockchain for a second. What does this technology mean? Let's assume that they are solved. Let's assume that those technical problems are solved over the next decade or so. Well, Bitcoin was actually an incredibly important proof of concept in a new type of institutional technology, a technology for rules. Remember that I said that before. A blockchain is a distributed ledger technology. And what these ledgers are is that they are tools for creating new institutions that facilitate economic, social, and political coordination. Now, we don't normally think about this, right? This is a very odd technology, and it's part of the reason why people don't often understand it very well. When we think about blockchain, we should be thinking about it in a class of technologies like we just invented the joint stock company, or we just invented the idea of a hierarchical government. These are institutional technologies. They're rule systems that help us to trade and exchange and trust each other. And they're quite different to the technologies we normally see. When we think of technologies, we think of industrial technologies like lasers and 3D printers, right? Industrial technologies help us to produce things faster and better and cheaper, right? That's different to an institutional technology. Institutional technologies help us trade and coordinate with each other. And what this means is that blockchains are essentially a technology of trust. They are a way to create trust in a shared ledger without a central third party. And this is very new. We normally keep our ledgers about who owns what, who has what rights, who can vote in this election, who has power in this organization. We keep those ledgers, they're kept by a central third party, either a firm or a government. Blockchains do that in a different way. They provide that trust in a different way. And institutional technologies are actually very rare. They don't come along very often, right? And that means that we must think about them differently. So what we're developing in my team at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub is institutional cryptoeconomics. So we're fantastic at making up long words. This is a book that some of my colleagues wrote. We're economists, right? So we're institutional economists. We look out at the world, and what we see are people using different institutions to solve problems of trust and information. So what do I mean by that? For some things, we use firms. We create hierarchical firms with management who monitor employees, who create internal contracts. Sometimes we buy things over markets using market exchange. And sometimes we use governments as a trusted third party to maintain a property register, for instance. These are all different institutions that we use to solve problems of trust and information in the ledgers of an economy. When I talk about institutional cryptoeconomics, what I mean is we're using these same tools. There's a big body of economic thought around these tools to analyze blockchain as a new institution in the economy and see how that affects firms and markets and governments. Now, it's easy to think that institutions don't really matter. We don't often, it might seem a little bit boring to look at an economy and think about the structure of the economy. Well, some of my colleagues did an estimate that around 35% of the GDP in an economy, so 35% of the things that we produce, are in the business of producing trust. What do accountants do? Accountants audit ledgers. They check that those ledgers are correct and legitimate and that there isn't any fraud. What do lawyers do? Lawyers help us to write contracts and enforce contracts. An enormous amount of our economy is in the business of producing trust in ledgers about who owns what, who has what rights, and ensuring us that when we trade with someone, they're not going to rip us off or cheat. So even if blockchain disrupts a tiny amount of that 35% of GDP that we currently use essentially hierarchies or central parties to produce trust, that's an enormous opportunity. So very briefly, I know I'm laboring this point, but it's something that people don't understand when they're thinking about this technology. When we talk about technologies normally, we have this vision that we're going to take a factory like this one, and we're going to take the workers and we're going to replace them with robots, right? This is the idea. We'll have people in firms and then they'll be replaced by some kind of machinery. That may be true for an industrial technology like a machine. When we're talking about an institutional technology like blockchain, we need to look at the boundaries of organizations. We're talking about a technology of governance. So what if one of the reasons why this firm existed was to ensure trust between different parties within the firm? So a lot of firms do this, right? Instead of buying products over a market that are an input into your product, say you're building a plane, you might not trust the products that are coming in. So what do? You grow your firm and you produce those products in-house. You're solving a trust problem by using a hierarchy. Now, to the extent that blockchain solves some of those hierarchical trust problems in a decentralized way, what we would expect is for bigger firms to split up into smaller firms and to be knitted together or networked together using blockchain technology. So I just want you to keep this vision in your mind. I'm laboring the point here. Before 2009, the economy used three main different institutions to solve trust problems. Sometimes we use markets to solve problems. Sometimes we used firms, sometimes we used governments. After 2009, we have a major fourth option in how do we solve trust problems. And that is what the entrepreneurial sort of hype and endeavor is about in blockchain technology. What these entrepreneurs are thinking about is an economy is made up of an enormous amount of centralized ledgers, either in firms or governments. Which of those ledgers are better governed using blockchain, using a decentralized distributed ledger technology? It's not going to be every single ledger that we have in an economy. But the hype we have right now is a discovery phase. We're thinking, okay, can we take supply chain information and instead of recording it on centralized ledgers, we can do it in a decentralized way? Can we take your education credentials that you might have from your school or university, instead of them holding the credentials, can we put it on a decentralized ledger? The same for asset registries and potentially votes and health data and decentralized identity. Can blockchain unbundle and carve out some of those activities of firms and governments and create them in a decentralized way? That's what the excitement is about. And that's why it's hard to think about this technology. When you see a big hierarchical firm trying to use a blockchain, it's hard to think about it because they're a hierarchical firm. Why do they have a decentralized technology inside them? It's all very complex. So to the topic that you probably thought I was going to talk about today, just a little bit of a recap of what I've said. So blockchains are an institutional technology. They're a technology for creating new rule systems. And we need to think about how those rule systems compete or complement or however they change existing institutions. So let's talk a little bit about special jurisdictions, right? So special jurisdictions defined very broadly, we're talking about special economic zones all the way to seasteading and free ports. And what kind of holds a lot of these together is the idea that, say for most of them, not seasteading perhaps, we'll take a host jurisdiction, right, the government of Australia, and we will carve out an area, a part of that area that is a different jurisdiction and it has different rules, right? It has different institutions. Those institutions might be less regulated. They might have been copied from some other jurisdiction and imported into that zone or that jurisdiction. When we talk about special jurisdictions, we're talking about competitive governance. So more and different sets of institutions that people can choose between. That's fundamentally what we're talking about. Now, this may sound a little bit crazy, But blockchains are themselves tools for creating special jurisdictions, but non-territorial special jurisdictions. And I'll explain that in a second. And then this technology can also be used for special jurisdictions. So when we build a new special economic zone or a new seastead or whatever it happens to be, those special jurisdictions need governance. They need institutions too. They need systems of contracting. They need the equivalent of courts. They need voting. Blockchain is a potential new infrastructure that we can use to experiment in these zones with this technology. So, first of all, blockchains are actually themselves a type of special jurisdiction. As I said when I was in the introduction, what this technology does is it lowers the costs of non-territorial exit. What this means, we can call it crypto secession, that's what it tends to be called in the literature. It means that the monopoly of institutions that you live under is gone. In the past, if you lived in Mexico or you lived in Australia, you don't really get a choice over the institutions that you live under, right? You have a court system and it's tied to the jurisdiction that you are physically in. You have a money and it is tied to the jurisdiction that you are physically in. Since 2008, 2009, that monopoly on institutions has started to break much more rapidly. And what I mean by that is you can be in your current jurisdiction right now and you can decide, okay, I'm going to write a smart contract using a blockchain rather than use the existing court system of the country that I'm in. That's a truly remarkable development, right? And it's not just smart contracts. It's not just legal systems. It's also money. It's also, you can create new private governance organizations, right? The point here is blockchains in a way are creating thousands of new special jurisdictions that you can choose from without moving from your current jurisdiction, without physically moving to a special economic zone or moving to a seastead or whatever that happens to be. Now, for those interested in special jurisdictions, the benefits of this are really clear. The first one is, of course, you get more institutional competition. You get more choice over the rules that you live under. And that's great. But it also puts pressure on existing jurisdictions and institutions to change, right? The threat of people in a jurisdiction deciding to use other currencies much more easily is a kind of check on power of the existing monetary authority. They have to manage their money better, or there's some pressure there. The same is true with smart contracts and courts. If people start to develop new decentralized legal systems, including dispute resolution systems and a lot of the things that courts do, well, that places pressure on existing courts to be less corrupt, right? There's an element here that just the threat of these new technologies there might help to improve the existing institutions. And this is super interesting because I spent a lot of time thinking about economic development and the theory of economic development. Now, the history of economic development is we tend to identify a problem in the economy. We think, okay, there's a gap between the savings the economy has and the investment they need to have, so we need financial aid. Or we identify there needs to be coordinated investment across the economy, so we try and centrally plan it, right? But what everyone has, not everyone, the consensus now is that the problem around economic development is that we need good institutions. We need institutions of property rights, we need institutions of rule of law, and so on and so forth. But we don't really have any answers about how we could get that institutional change, right? We see a lot of developed economies just pointing at developing economies and saying, well, maybe you should be a little bit less corrupt in your courts. Maybe you need to be a bit more democratic, right? That's not solving the problem. The institutions are entrenched and they're very hard to change, right? Politics is messy and hard. And now that we have this new technology, perhaps there's a different approach to getting institutional change. Rather than getting institutional change through politics, through basically convincing governments to put good institutions in, we can build new institutions, right? We have these technologies that enable us to build institutions, build new jurisdictions, and put pressure on those existing jurisdictions. Now, the other side of the coin, the flip side, is that blockchains are also a technology that can be used in special jurisdictions. So in CSEDs, in special economic zones. Why? Well, it's for all the reasons that I've described. Blockchains are tools to build institutions like property registries, like voting, like contracts, like different monies, and they can be used in these new frontier spaces. Well, why? Well, the first one is, and it's not talked about as much as I would like, but special jurisdictions need institutions and governance too. It isn't as simple as we're just going to pick up some institutions, we're going to drop them in a space and everything will be fine. We need to decide what those institutions are. They're likely to need to change over time as the population changes, as investment comes in. These are all governance problems. They're all institutional problems. And of course, special jurisdictions are effective test beds for experimentation. One of the major problems will be with this blockchain technology will be as it increasingly comes up and competes with existing regulations and entrenched interests within jurisdictions. Perhaps special jurisdictions can be a way that we escape that kind of path dependency, right? And test new systems of governance within special jurisdictions. And that actually goes back and there's some learning back to existing institutions. So there's a paper here where myself and my colleague, Aaron Lane, have talked a little bit about this governance problem in special economic zones and the potential for blockchain to solve some of those problems. I thought I'd briefly mention, I've only got a couple of minutes left before we go to questions, but I thought I'd briefly mention this concept of cryptodemocracy. Obviously, there is an election happening at the moment. You've probably heard about that. We wrote a book in 2019, which feels like about 10 years ago now. But in 2019, we wrote this book on cryptodemocracy. And what this is it's the idea that we can use blockchain technology as an institutional technology as voting infrastructure. So instead of recording votes in a centralized ledger or centralized 50 centralized ledgers across a particular country, perhaps we could use this technology in a different way. And what we mean by a crypto democracy is a blockchain-based collective choice infrastructure. So it's a digital infrastructure on which people can coordinate their voting rights. Now, we develop a lot of the theory in this book around your votes are actually a type of property right in an election. or in any collective choice. So it's a property right in the sense that it says you own it, and it says to you that you can turn up every 3 years, vote for these candidates, you can do this, but you can't do this, it must be a secret ballot, and so on and so forth. Well, we think that blockchain opens up entirely new structures of democratic decision-making that haven't really been developed or applied yet. We talk a little bit about these in the book, and we can talk about them in questions if people are interested, but this isn't just voting for governments. It's also voting for in corporations through shareholder voting, in unions, in civil society. Can we rethink the way that we structure our democratic systems because this technology opens up new possibilities? So the thing I want to stress here is that when we apply blockchain to voting, don't just be thinking we are going to take our existing democratic structures and make them digital and put them on a blockchain. This opens up entirely new possibilities about how we structure that democracy and the rules in that collective choice. Perhaps you can, instead of just voting for people within your electorate, perhaps you can delegate your vote to someone else that you know. Perhaps you can split your vote up into different parts so that you retain your vote on some parts, on some issues, but delegate your rights on other issues. The point here is that for years we've talked about different structures of democracy that might more effectively coordinate knowledge and provide better outcomes, but we haven't been able to put them into practice at scale because we haven't had the technology that enables us to contract your vote securely, for instance, without relying on a third party. Why for special jurisdictions? Well, special jurisdictions also need governance, as I've mentioned, and they might need to evolve very quickly as the franchise changes, as the population grows, as the issues around it change, as investment comes in. And so these may be a great space to create these kind of adaptive governance structures. We may talk about this a little bit more in question time, I'm not sure, but I'll leave cryptodemocracy there. I will actually finish the presentation. I've gone a little bit over time. I feel like I'm spruiking many books today. This is a book we released a few months ago called The New Technologies of Freedom. A lot of the ideas that I've talked about today are actually in that book. We published it with the American Institute for Economic Research. The basic motivation for us writing this book is that for those interested in expanding human liberty, they tend to try and achieve that change through politics by convincing the public that these are good institutions or trying to go through the democratic process. Well, in 2020, we have a remarkable suite of new technologies: blockchain, smart contracts, zero knowledge proofs, encryption, lots and lots of technologies that mean the optimum approach may have changed. Rather than seeking change through politics, we can build those institutions. We can build new institutions that push competition into governance, that it lets people choose which institutions and rules they wish to live under, which money they want to use, which contracting system they want to use. And I hope this argument is actually very amenable to the people in the special jurisdiction space because they understand this. Right? This is a lot of the motivation behind special economic zones and so on. Let's go and build these spaces and let people come if they like it. And that same principle applies across a whole range of different technologies. And I'm super excited about them. And I'm mainly working on blockchain because that's the that's the sort of foundational stack of a lot of these tech. But I'm super excited. And I hope some of those, I hope some of that was insightful to you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this presentation. That blockchain is a specific point and is very important to implement in the new society. So here in Mexico, we know about this term, but we are not involved as much as you in Australia. So thank you for your presentation. And here we have some questions in relation to this technology. And one says that, how do you perceive the adoption of this technology in society, in a specific sector? Because it could be different for government, for entrepreneurs, and also for people that wants to know more about this technology. But how do you perceive the adaptability of this technology?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good question. It's actually really hard to think about that because it's occurring across every industry at once, and a lot of the applications cross over different industries as well. I can talk about some of the big ones that are being developed at the moment. So the first application really after money, so after Bitcoin, was in supply chains and logistics. So what the application there is how supply chains don't just carry physical goods. Supply chains must also carry information about those goods. So where did that product come from? Where is it going? Who owns it? Who has trade finance on it? There's an enormous amount of information about goods as they move. And today, most of that information is kept in the equivalent of centralized ledgers, right? Each firm along a supply chain keeps their own records. There's lots of pieces of paper that pass around. That's not a joke. That's an enormous amount of global trade today is still largely paper-based. Now, this is an excellent application of blockchain technology because what we have is we have distributed parties. So we have everywhere from the initial lobster farmer off the south coast of Australia all the way to the restaurant and the customer in Beijing, China. All the parties along the way, the logistics providers, governments, customs officials, they don't know each other and they don't necessarily trust each other. So that's one of the main applications of blockchain that we saw very early on. But the problem is that in a scenario where you have distributed parties who don't trust each other, it's also really hard to get them all to adopt a new technology, right? So in many of the applications where blockchain makes sense, where a lot of parties need to be on the same platform, on the same blockchain platform, they don't know, they don't trust each other, they don't often talk to each other because they're often competitors. So that's one of the major adoption problems that we face. And it's not necessarily a technical problem, it's actually a people problem. How do you get an entire supply chain to agree to adopt a platform? So that's one of the major challenges we're seeing in adoption. There's a few different ways that will be solved. On one hand, you could have a company, which Walmart, for instance, came out and said, we are going to require all suppliers of leafy greens to us to use a blockchain-based tracking platform, right? A big buyer comes out and says, we're making you do this, right? That's one of the ways that adoption will happen. It's not necessarily the best way. But yeah, the adoption question is a hard one because it's different for every single industry. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Darcy. We have another question here. It says, if a smart contract is defined by a code, what if there is a bug in the code? How can we trust that contract if there is a bug in the code?
That is a very, very good question, and it is a very big problem. So I didn't really explain smart contracts, so I might explain them a little bit more broadly. So a smart contract isn't really very smart. A smart contract is just a contract that we write into code that is automatically executed on a blockchain network. So what that means is I could write a contract with anyone in this call, a smart contract saying, I bet that the weather on Tuesday will be above 40 degrees. And we can agree that if the weather is above 40 degrees, based on this weather particular source, that contract will automatically execute and we can do nothing about it, right? We write it into code, we agree on a source of information known as an oracle that comes into that smart contract. There's a lot of problems with, you need that. What if there's an error in that oracle? What if for some reason that weather service doesn't provide accurate data that day and there's some kind of disagreement, but the contract is automatically executed? We can't do anything about that, right? I may have accidentally won that bet even though I should have lost. So there's a lot of work going into dispute resolution for blockchain smart contracts. So how can we create systems where if a contract goes wrong, and many of them will, how do we resolve that dispute? Maybe instead of just agreeing on an oracle provider, on a weather source, we also agree that this is the dispute resolution process that we will use if one of us has a disagreement. And there's many different ways to do that dispute resolution process, but there's a huge amount of work going into it. I will note that this is a massive problem in the blockchain space, because smart contracts, the way that the world works is that most contracts are what economists would call, or lawyers call, incomplete contracts. We can't write down all of the possible scenarios that could happen in the future and what we agree to do if that if the other party doesn't fulfill that contract. So think of an employment contract, right? You might enter into an employment contract with your employer that says you will do quality work, right? And you will have all the, it'll be very unverifiable information that we can externally prove. Imagine trying to code that into a smart contract. You can't do it, right? It's not going to happen. We might be able to create it some way to do just the payment or something, but a huge amount of an economy is made up of incomplete contracts, and people are going to try to code these contracts into smart contracts, and it's not going to work. So what we're figuring out at the moment is which parts of an economy can we essentially take out all of the discretion, and it still works as a contract with some kind of dispute resolution process. So I might leave it there. It's a great question. There's also a lot of there are a lot of bugs in various blockchain platforms at the moment. We've seen this, so in the last few months, it's been pretty wild. People have been developing what they call decentralized finance, or DeFi. This is using blockchain technology to create decentralized financial instruments that enable you to borrow and lend kind of financial instruments on a blockchain. There's been a lot of bugs in these codes. People have lost a lot of money. And then the community kind of comes around and says, well, how can we fix this problem? Should we have the code audited before we code it? Should we have some kind of backdoor so that it can be reversed? There's a lot of governance challenges that sit around blockchain rather than just the blockchain itself. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a very long question. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's perfect. So we have another question that is related with that one. And it specific says, Moises said, how will contracts be enforced in non-digital domains? And I want to add in this part that blockchain smart contracts also has another point that is something related with legal validity, because sometimes we think that it's because it's not something that I can touch, is not has not any kind of validity. But this is a very good question. So what can you tell us more about these questions about enforced non-digital domains?
That is a very good question. And it's really hard, right? So we can say as much as we want, but we can say as much as we want that a property registry, your land titles are on a blockchain. But if someone comes and takes that land away from you, the blockchain doesn't matter anymore, right? Well, how does this physical and the digital world meet? That problem has not been solved, but it's starting to go through the courts at the moment, through sort of territorial courts. We're seeing very early cases around, will governments recognize a smart contract as valid or recognize some property as valid and then enforce it using their own physical resources? We don't have a solution to that problem, but
Yes.
it's worth noting that as the economy becomes more digital, as we have more assets that are kind of natively digital rather than physical, then that enforcement in the non-digital world doesn't matter as much. It may be the case that these kind of physical aspects are solved in a different way, in a more analog, traditional way, whereas everything else that we can create natively digital is enforced in a digital way. But the lesson here is just wait and see, because it's going through the courts at the moment. There's a number of cases in Australia around, my colleague Aaron Lane is working on this around are these contracts recognised and so on. So I can't provide too much more information about that.
Okay, perfect. So Claudia says, how can we use blockchain in the deliverance of public service?
That's a great question.
Yes.
So, well, it's a hard question to answer because, so when we think about government, there's a whole range of things that the government does that are really just, they're acting as a trusted third party. So they've got a property registry, they've got a intellectual property registry, and so on and so forth. So a lot of those things may end up being disrupted and they won't even be seen as kind of public things that governments do anyway. So some things will actually be essential, the equivalent of privatized over time. They'll be taken away from government hands. In the public sector, I think this will take a long time, but there will be an increasing focus on using this technology to get more cross-departmental kind of collaboration, linking up different parts of the government that are currently siloed in different departments. And as we link them up, the entire machine might become a little bit more efficient. There's talk of, could you use, I don't know the case in the countries that the people are in on this call. In Australia, for instance, we have schemes, one thing called the NDIS, where you might get some money, a kind of welfare or social security to spend that you can only spend on certain products. That money might just be for healthcare or for disability care or whatever that is. Where we'll slowly move towards a world where the government's giving that money to you in a kind of programmable money that means that you can only spend it on those things, and it will reduce a lot of fraud in that sense. What are the other ones? So I think really in government, a lot of it is just going to be applied to additional transparency within their budgets and across different levels and departments of governments. That will be what happens, but it will take a long time because a lot of people don't want that to happen.
Perfect. So I don't know if you have more time. We also had another 2 or 3 questions. If you can't respond it. Okay, perfect. Yes. Okay. So the next question says, are there countries in which government are supporting big blockchain related initiatives?
So it does vary from country to country. What's happened over time is that some countries have had a really good reputation for being what we can call crypto friendly, in the sense that these countries have been very clear that we don't know what regulatory challenges are coming up with this technology, but we are going to be flexible and we are going to let people try this technology and use this technology, and we'll be flexible around it. And we call that crypto friendliness. So these countries kind of change every day, but a lot of people talk about Switzerland, and so the term supporting big projects can mean a lot of things. So a lot of the support that entrepreneurs want is not necessarily here's some money. It's, hey, we're not going to shut your business down if you try and do some new things. And that's where I see the big support kind of elements. So things like countries that have regulatory sandboxes, which enable companies to go into this sandbox and play, that's why it's called a sandbox, under reduced regulatory requirements. So Australia has one of these. If I wanted to develop a new financial product using blockchain technology, I, with some conditions, would be able to go and test that technology under supervision of the regulator without a license. So the regulator will be watching and there's various checks, but this is a way that governments can learn off the companies. The companies get to trial the product and see if it works on real consumers. So in a way, what we mean by blockchain companies, governments supporting blockchain companies, is that it's not really about money at the moment. It's about are they open for business, in a way. That sounds like a cliche term. In Australia, for instance, we have a national blockchain roadmap that is being developed at the moment, which is the government going through and looking at several use cases of this technology and seeing if there are any potential barriers to adoption, if there are any regulatory problems. So that's a big way that governments are supporting.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, I think this is a good point, that we have the relationship with governments and all the private sector in order to get the digitalization. So I think we are going to have to work in this relationship, but it's not impossible. We need to find new ways, new advance to improve the relationship between governments and all this technology, that sometimes is quite difficult that government can adopt this technology because they are very disrupting in a way that they don't trust a lot of this new technology. So thank you for responding. And also we have another question, and I think this is the last question by your time. So it says, how can we move to a concept of a vote more linked to a decision process than just casting a ballot?
How can we link a vote to a decision process rather than just casting a vote? Is that? what the question was?
Just casting a ballot, no? Just voting every 3, 6, 5 years, I don't know, every period of time, but more like the whole decision process and not just an act that happened only one day each 5 years.
That is a very big question right now. So it's a tough question. So one of the things, so I mentioned briefly in the presentation, I think this will happen in part by changing what we mean by voting in an election. So at the moment, as you say, we vote every 3 years or 4 years. We hope that that election is legitimate and that that government may do what we voted them to do, but they probably won't, right? That's how elections work at the moment. And in theory, we can throw them out in 3 years if that doesn't happen. I think we'll move towards voting that happens much more regularly. So there's this idea of direct democracy that we have at the moment, which is you vote on lots and lots of issues rather than just voting for a particular representative. There's a lot of other systems. So this cryptodemocracy concept that we write about in this book is that maybe you could delegate your vote to other people sideways rather than only being able to vote for people in your electorate, right? And you might be able to delegate it for a year, or you might be able to delegate it for 10 years, right? What you have then is you have people who are engaging in the democratic process in the way that they want to. So some people might want to vote on every single issue, and some people just go, okay, I trust this person that I know to vote on my behalf. Now, one of the problems with the direct democracy system, where you're voting all the time on every issue, is that it takes a lot of effort for people to think about those issues, to create some kind of informed position about them. And in reality, people just don't do that, right? A lot of people don't want to engage at that level. So we're kind of thinking about how do you create a system where the people that want to engage can, and the people that don't want to engage can still engage, but on a different margin. So at the moment, you either vote or you don't vote, right? What if we're moving to a world where the people that want to vote all the time on lots of issues can, the people that don't still get a say, they still get to choose who votes all the time on their behalf. So that's one way forward. The other way is developing different structures of democracy, in the sense that I mentioned quadratic voting as a possibility. I'm not sure if people know what quadratic voting is. So quadratic voting is this idea, and I'll give you a very simple introduction. You can buy more votes in an election, but you pay the square amount for each additional vote. So imagine your first vote costs you $1, your second vote costs you $4, your third vote costs you $9, your fourth vote costs you 16, and so on and so forth. So it gets very expensive very quickly to buy lots of votes. But hold up for a second, because obviously money in elections is a very big and contested problem. So what if everyone was given, you get the equivalent of 100 voice credits, 100 credits to spend over these 10 issues, right? You've got 10 different issues you can vote on. You've got 100 voice credits. You can decide, okay, I really care about this issue, so I'm going to buy 10 votes in this. Or you can spread it out across the different votes. What you've done in a system like that, which is called quadratic voting, is you've created a system where when people care more about an issue, they can express that intensity of preference. So in a normal representative democracy right now, you could have 51% of people who don't really care about an issue override 49% of people, the minority, who really, really care about that issue. Right? As an economist, you're looking at this and going, hey, wait, there needs to be some kind of trade here. This doesn't make sense. The problem is that the 49% who care really strongly can't express their intensity of preference. So quadratic voting is one way that we might be able to do that. Create a system where people can express their intensity of preference. And you could do that with sort of an artificial money, like voice credits, and you hand them out. Or you can do it with real money, which is a whole different story. There's a lot of effort thinking about that, which is let people use real money in an election to buy more votes. That money goes into a pool of money, and then it is distributed across all of the people in the election. So I might care really strongly about this issue. I have to spend a lot of money if I want to express my preference strongly, but that money will be then spread out across all the other people in the election evenly. So there's a lot of different ways to develop this, and I'm not sure if it exactly answers the question, but I think that voting is going to move towards looking very different to what it does now.
Thank you.
So now we have the last question. I don't know if you have time for one more, because I think this is a very important question, so you can answer it. This is only the last. Okay, so it's by Adrian, and says, how could a new party get access to an already implemented blockchain system? Possible to, or do all parties needs to be explicit since beginning? It's related with the last questions, with this democracy.
Yes, of course. It's easier to explain not in a democratic system, because the problem with the democracy is you need to have very strong identities of these are the people in the election who are allowed to vote, and that's one of the major problems. So I won't talk about democracy in this instance, but let's go back to the supply chain example. There's two different classes of blockchains in a way. So there's public blockchains like Bitcoin, and in a public blockchain, it means that anyone can theoretically come on, join the network, get a wallet, and buy and transact some Bitcoin, right? And also anyone, if they have the computing power, can come on and become one of those computers who are maintaining the network, right? They're very open about who can join. A lot of the major blockchains that you hear about are those public blockchains. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, they're public kind of permissionless blockchains where anyone can join in. But there's also a huge amount of work going into what are known as private or permissioned blockchains. In that circumstance, imagine if everyone on this call got together and said, let's create a blockchain network. We know who everyone on this call is. We will each be a node within the system, right? Yes. So we know who each other are. We can decide if someone else wants to join and become a node. Now, the benefit here is that this is slightly more decentralized than a lot of existing centralized ledgers. But the system can work in a completely different way. You can work a lot faster. Changes can be made if things go wrong much more easily. So there's this trade-off between a public blockchain and a private blockchain. There's work going into both of them, but they have different access rights about who can come in and read and write to the ledger. So the answer is not all parties need to be explicit since the beginning, in general, right? So even in a private blockchain, you'll have a consortia that's formed, like all these people on the call, but they can bring more people in if they want to. If everyone on the networks decides that they want to bring more people in, then they can. And it's also important to separate out, there are those nodes, those computers that are maintaining the network. They're the ones doing the work and processing the transactions. In Bitcoin, you would have heard of miners. That's what a miner is. They're the people processing the transactions. But there's also users who can use the blockchain to transact. It's very easy for parties to come in and use and transact on most of these chains. A lot of the question is about the mining side of it. But I'll leave it there. Thank you for your question. Okay,
thank you so much. They are all the questions that we have for our audience. So it's a very important topic, and the people very like this topic about blockchain technologies. So right now, this is all of for the event. Thank you so much, Darcy, for being here today, for accept our invitation. And we remind you that this is an initiative for the Policy Laboratory for Security and Development here in Mexico. There is in Yucatan, and also in collaboration with Startup Society Foundation and the Institute of Competitive Governance. Remember that tomorrow we have another event that is focused on investment in this special economic zone, and that is for all for this event today. Darcy, if you want to give us the last message, if you have any message for us in resume to the importance of blockchain technology in all the society for get a freedom in the governments, digital governance, and more transparent. So if you want to say the last word, and then it will be the all for us in this event. So Darcy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I hope I can. I hope I can come to Mexico soon and visit. I've never been to Mexico, so I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks for coming. I won't say much because we're already over time, and I have to run to something else. But if you're interested in this technology, please go out and read about it and start to use it, and consider if you are someone thinking about even working in the development space or working in the social impact space or whatever it is, think about learning a lot about these new technologies and taking the approach of building new institutions rather than just trying to change them through politics, right? We have a whole new path here where you can build these big non-territorial platforms that anyone across the world can use. And that is a super interesting development for the developing world and the developed world alike. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Darcy. And we have to did another event with you in other occasion, of course. And that's all for today. Have a new evening or morning, Darcy, in Australia. So thank you so much, and bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.